I completely understand the desire for FBA people to want delineation. Hey y'all. Oh my gosh. I feel like we are in the twilight zone because we are back here again. We gotta talk about anti-blackness within the non-FBA, non-ADOS community. So I don't know, I'm not gonna insert them here because they're very harmful and I don't want to re-traumatize people who already watched it the first time, but I will leave the links if you want to see what videos I'm talking about. But I saw a couple days ago a video of a Haitian woman. It looked like a skit to me, but she called Black Americans dirty, and I thought that that was like a skit to make the podcast go viral. And then I saw a mutual connect that I have on social media. She posted a video of a Sierra Leonean woman who said that she wanted to cause harm to the Black American community. I'm gonna leave both of those videos a link in the description box because, again, I don't want to insert them and re-traumatize people who watched them initially. Y'all, we gotta talk about anti-blackness within the non-FBA community. For those of you who are not familiar, FBA is a term that means Foundational Black American. I know that it's interchangeable with the term ADOS, and I'm not quite sure. I read online, but I don't know the truth and veracity. But I'm aware of the individuals who created the term ADOS, which is American Descendants of Slavery. And I think there was a rift between those folks and the Tariq Nasheeds and the people that created Foundational Black Americans, that term. But that's neither here nor there. I'm gonna be using the term FBA in this video, but an FBA is somebody who descended from enslaved people whose family has been here, a Black person whose family has been here for multiple generations. I completely understand the desire for FBA people to want delineation because there's a lot of folks from my country, there's a lot of Cameroonians, there's a lot of Nigerians, there's a lot of children of these people who hold on to and believe these really problematic narratives and stereotypes. And I'm not trying to broad brush because I know that there's going to be some people in the comments saying not all. Of course, I'm not talking about all of anyone, but there is enough of it that I've seen and that so many of us have seen. There's a pattern. I do want to say though that I don't want to act like the disrespect and the harm has been one-sided. What we're seeing on social media, I think all of this is a psyop and it's a distraction and it's a way to keep Black people globally distracted. But I do think that there is very real harm that Black immigrants and children of Black immigrants have caused toward Black Americans that must be owned, acknowledged, and there has to be accountability for. But I also think that we have to have a conversation about the harm that both Black immigrants and perhaps the children of Black immigrants feel when it comes to Black Americans and the harm that they may have experienced. Because I do think that we have to talk about how harm has been caused on both sides and the way that we get to healing. Because my question through this whole video is, and anytime I talk about this topic, I always try to think about how do we get to a place of healing for our communities, because I do feel like there's a fracture within the Black diaspora and these fractures just keep growing, but I don't think that we have had a chance to really heal. I think when I ask myself this question of how we heal, part of the reason why I wrote this book, Rise and Resist, is because I felt like I live in the US and there's a lot of conversation on how amazing Black Americans have been throughout history and all of the movements and the advancements that Black Americans have made and how it has benefited all of us. But I don't think that enough of us take the time to also learn global Black history and learn about people like Patrice Lumumba and Thomas Sankara and Miriam Makeba And all of these pivotal figures, Black figures. And so part of the reason why I wrote my new book, Rise and Resist, is to look at this legacy of global Black resistance and what it can teach us about resistance right now. And so when I ask myself this question of how we get to a point of healing within the African diaspora and the Black diaspora, because I know that there's some Black people that don't consider themselves African, so I'm just gonna say the Black diaspora. But how do we get to a place of healing? The first thing is we need to acknowledge the harm that has been caused. Black immigrants and children of Black immigrants have to acknowledge the harm that we have caused. How repeating words like Akata have perpetuated harm, right? Akata is a harmful term that is used within a lot of different West African cultures that essentially is like a derogatory term for Black Americans. There has been harm on both sides. You know, we always hear these stories of Gen Xers who say that they were called African booty scratchers. I was never called African booty scratcher, partially because people didn't know. I grew up in mostly white environments. So I think that my conception of Blackness is different because I didn't know about these delineations within the Black community. To the white people I went to school with, I was just a Black girl. My name is not a traditional name that would indicate that I am African. So people just assumed that I was a Black person, and I never really made that differentiation up until I got to college, when I met other first generation and second generation Africans, and there were a lot of Ethiopians and one of my best friends is Eritrean. There were a lot of West Africans I got to know, and that was when I started leaning more into my heritage and my culture. But I was never like, oh yeah, I'm Cameroonian, because I was raised, again, in the US, and at that point I had never been to Cameroon, and I don't speak the language, so it was like I didn't really identify with the culture as much as I identified as being a young Black girl. So we have to acknowledge the harm that we've caused, right? I can be really honest, and in my book, I wrote a book called Decentering Whiteness in the Workplace, and I talked in that book about how this culture of whiteness is what is harming our workplaces, right? The expectations of professionalism are all rooted in white culture, and how that harms everybody in the workplace. And one of the things I talked about in the book, I had a whole chapter on how I centered whiteness in my life and how I was trying to be white through the music that I listened to. I wanted my peers to accept me. I was really into rock music growing up. I was a big fan of Red Hot Chili Peppers and all of these. Even though rock music, Black people originated all genres of music, even though Black people, we started rock music, I wanted my peers to like me. So I admonished rap music and hip hop. My brother and my sister, they loved the Master P song, Make 'Em Say, And I remember I used to be like, ew, I don't like that song. My sister loved Destiny's Child. And she had that first CD where they had the No, No, No song. And I didn't really like them, to be honest with you. I love Beyonce now, but I was not really into R&B, because I felt like I didn't like anything associated with Blackness. And there were many points in my life, even in my decision to go to a predominantly white institution for college, all of that was rooted in the way that I centered whiteness. And so I think that there must be an acknowledgement of the harm, acknowledgement of the ways that we have internalized white culture, and that piece, as Audre Lorde said, we have to acknowledge and recognize that piece of the oppressor that's buried within us. And for me, that has shown up in many ways, from the way that I used to wear my hair to the music that I listen to. So we have to acknowledge our pains and bring them to the table, and not be afraid to say, as a maybe child of immigrants, these are the ways that I feel like I've been harmed by Black Americans. And then Black Americans, ADOS folks and FBA folks have to come to the table and say, these are the many ways that y'all have harmed us. I would say for me personally, as one individual, I can't think of many stories of being harmed or feeling harmed by Black Americans. I'm in community with Black Americans and with FBA folks. And so I don't have stories, but my parents definitely have stories. So I think for me, I don't feel that same sort of, I want Black solidarity globally. So I don't feel that same sort of feeling that maybe somebody who experienced harm at the hands of their diasporic siblings may feel. But I do feel like one of the ways we get to healing is acknowledging the harms that we've experienced and the harms that we have caused. Second, we cannot be afraid to learn more about each other. Part of the problem, and I mentioned this in my previous video, is that in the Shabuzi video, I talked about how a lot of black immigrants and children of Black immigrants come to the US and they don't know Black history. They don't know the sacrifices that Black Americans made, and that Black Americans are the reason we're even able to be here. And so I think that Black people coming from abroad it should be imperative that we learn Black American history. That is 100% a non-negotiable. But also, I do think that Black Americans, FBA folks, should take the time to explore. I talked in a video that I think is still on my page about how when we got married for our honeymoon, we went to Egypt and Ghana. And I remember when I would tell people, we spent the majority of our time in Ghana. And this was a little bit before going to Ghana was like the cool thing, and going to West Africa was like more in vogue and in style than it is now. But I remember multiple people being like, oh, you're going to Africa? Like, people were flummoxed. They were like, you're not going to go to Italy or France or Bali or this place or that place? No, I'm going to go to the motherland. And so we have to be learning, we have to be taking the initiative and taking the opportunity to learn about our cultures. If you are somebody that was born and raised in the US and your family has been here for generations, I think it's important for you to understand what Black people abroad have experienced, because all of our liberation movements are interconnected. What Kwame Nkrumah did to free Ghana and to make Ghana the first African nation to be free are the same strategies that Toussaint Louverture used to free Haiti, are the same strategies that Ida B. Wells used, are the same strategies that Black people here used for liberation. And so I think that it's important, secondly, for us to learn about each other. Third, I think it's so imperative that we address our internalized anti-Blackness. And like I said, we recognize and reckon with that piece of the oppressor that is buried deep within us. As Audre Lorde said, to quote Audre Lorde, I loved this whole thing that I Show Speed did. I don't know much about him. I know he's a streamer. For his maybe 21st birthday, I know he traveled to several different countries within the continent of Africa, and he showed that Africa is not just huts and just impoverished villages. Like, there is a lot of beauty in Africa. There's a lot of just things that aren't shown in Western media, and I love that, right? I think it's important for us to, and I love that he said, I don't know if he said what exactly he said, but I think he kind of acknowledged that he didn't know Africa would be like that. And I think that our own whiteness that we've internalized, that we've grown up with, made us think that Africans are impoverished. I remember seeing the commercials with kids with the bellies, and it was like, donate 10 cents to save a child in Africa. This was back when Ethiopia had a famine, and they were just showing little Habesha kids on TV with these big bellies, and that was the images of Africa that are emblazoned in so many of our memories. And so it's really important for us to address the ways that we've internalized what we've seen and what we grew up in. I saw, and I want to make probably a separate video about this, but I do think we also need to take the opportunity to, here in the continental US, and those of us who live in Europe, and I think we need to take time to visit the motherland. I do think that there is an important conversation that is required about how we can't go visit these underdeveloped countries and be gentrifiers, right? There's a whole conversation about whether Americans, and specifically Black Americans, can be gentrifiers in African and Caribbean nations. I do think that there is a way that we can go to these countries and that we are extractive, and we have to avoid that, right? Avoid going to these places and spreading our American ideologies in these places. That's a whole nother conversation, but Khalees had a really interesting post on her Instagram page. I love Khalees since the days when she had rainbow hair, but she had a really interesting post. But if you go to that post on her Instagram page and you read the comments, it's really interesting because there's a lot of people that are kind of questioning this idea of sort of like everyone mass migrating to these impoverished countries and what that can sort of do to the economy, to the local community, how it can displace people. And so there's a really interesting conversation there. But I think it's important for us to understand why maybe we never decided to vacation in a place like Ghana, right? The ways that internalized oppression shows up for us is the third thing that we need to do to start or facilitate the healing process. So the fourth thing that we have to do when it comes to healing the diaspora is we have to recognize that we are stronger together. I definitely think that all of these conversations about, it just feels like a psyop. It feels like a distraction. It feels like a squirrel, and that we're so focused on why we hate Africans or why we hate Caribbeans or why we hate Black Americans, that we're not uniting to fight against our common enemy. So I do think that we have to realize that there's strength in unity and that we're better able and we're better apt to fight against these systems of oppression that harm all of us if we are united. I've had conversations with, I have a friend who is a Black immigrant. She came here for school, but she always tells me how this conversation is really interesting about Black Americans versus Black immigrants, because her experience has been, because she has an accent, a very thick accent, she's experienced accent discrimination, she's experienced exclusion from Black Americans, and she's experienced racism from her white peers. There is a level of privilege that a lot of people who are not descendants of enslaved people have. So Dr. Joy DeGruy has talked about in her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, this level of generational trauma that is epigenetic. And I do want to acknowledge that many of us, and I've said this in previous videos, but many of us who are children of immigrants don't have that generational trauma that a lot of our Black American peers have. But also, someone said this in a Clubhouse room years ago, but they were like, they came from a country where it was a war-torn country, and they did carry the generational trauma of the war that their grandparents lived through. And they were basically saying, to say that me as a Black immigrant or as a child of Black immigrants, I don't carry generational trauma is erasure to my history and my story. And I thought that that was a really powerful perspective that I did not initially think about. But I do want us to understand that we are, again, stronger together, and acknowledging our pains and the harms that we've caused, learning about each other's cultures and our history of resistance, and addressing the ways that we've internalized whiteness, white culture, and anti-Blackness is so vital for us to understand and realize we are stronger together. And then lastly, when it comes to this conversation about how we get to a point of healing, I think all of us, Black immigrants, children of Black immigrants, Black Americans, ADOS, FBA, we have to continue to call out the harm that we see. We cannot let stuff like this slide. When a Haitian girl goes on a podcast or a Sierra Leonean girl gets on TikTok, if there was a Black American who got up on social media and disparaged Africans and Caribbeans, we would have to call that out too. So we should take every opportunity we are given to call out the BS and to call out the harm that we see and that we witness online and anywhere else. So I think we have to continue to call out the harms that we see, that we witness on social media. So I want to commend the people that I've seen on my timeline talking about these issues, and I felt like it was a responsibility of mine, somebody who is a child of immigrants. And I felt like my perspective is valid, and I wanted to offer an additional perspective. So thank y'all so much for watching this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, all of that if you enjoy this type of content, and I will see y'all in the next video.